What is going on, folks? My name is Spice. This is Spice Can't Fish, and today we're talking swim baits. So I've had a few people actually comment and ask me to do this video in the past, so I figured since it's winter time and I'm kind of getting all my stuff organized and ready to go for next season, this would be a perfect opportunity to kind of give you guys a full tour over all of my swim baits. Now for some of you swim bait guys, this might not be any swim baits at all. For some of you guys out there, this might be a ton of swim baits. For me, I feel like every single bait that I have, at least right now, pretty much fills one or two niches for me. Back when I first started getting into swim baits, I ended up just going out and buying a bunch of baits that I didn't really know anything about, but I never really took the time to learn those baits and really understand how they worked. Never really ended up catching all that many fish on them. But over the past couple of years of throwing big swim baits, I've actually learned a little bit. I've learned what makes a good swim bait, what makes a swim bait not so good, what swim baits work for me and work for my style of fishing. I've been able to dial my swim bait collection in and kind of bulk it out to about 20 swim baits. So I figured this would be a perfect opportunity, like I said, to go through every single swim bait that I have in the arsenal right now. I have picked up a few swim baits over the winter, so you guys are gonna have to stick around for that unboxing at some point in the future. But yeah, like I said, I've had a couple of people ask me to do this video, so I figured this would be the perfect opportunity to kind of break down all my swim baits, tell you which ones I have, why I have each one of them. Like I said, each swim bait that I have kind of fills one or two niches. And yeah, I figured I'd go through each of my swim baits, kind of tell you guys why I have it, what it does for me, what I like about it, what I don't like about it as much, if there are some things that I don't like about specific baits. We're gonna go over rods and reels towards the end of the video as well, so we'll get into the 3 rods and reels that I use to throwing big swim baits as well. But yeah, I feel like this is gonna be kind of a long video, so we're gonna get right into it. I think we're gonna start over here with all the wake baits and then work our way through the bluegill style imitators and then all of my other random miscellaneous stuff over here. So I guess we may as well start with this little guy right here. This is the first like big swim bait that I ever gained any amount of confidence in. This is a Black Dog Bait Company shell cracker. It's the G2, the little tiny plastic version. I don't know what they call this color. It's just kind of like a natural bait fish kind of color, kind of like a bluegill, kind of like a perch, a shad, crappie. Could be really just about anything, but just kind of like an ambiguous color profile. But yeah, like I said, I have thrown this thing around a whole ton. I don't really throw it as much anymore just because I find myself kind of reaching for a bigger bait most of the time, but this was that first like big swim bait that I really got confidence in. Like I said, this is a crank down style bait, so it gets down to about 3 or 4 foot, kind of like a square bill, but if you work this thing super slow, you can kind of wake it up along the surface as well. And yeah, this is a little pond killer. Again, I like throwing this thing around in smaller bodies of water. I don't really find myself picking it up all that much in bigger bodies of water, or if I'm just trying to upsize my bite a little bit. Generally, I'll kind of go with one of the other style bluegill imitators that I have, but for little ponds and stuff, this is an absolute killer where they're feeding up on those smaller profile bluegill. These fish seem to absolutely kill them. I've caught a lot of like 1 to 2 pound fish on this thing, so definitely get a lot of bites on it, but I've caught a bunch of decent fish on it as well. So, but yeah, anywhere where there's like smaller bait fish or any sort of smaller body bluegill, I really like to throw this thing, again, especially around ponds. For whatever reason, those little pond fish seem to eat this thing up. Again, not really a bait that I find myself throwing too much anymore, but definitely has a place in the arsenal, and I definitely still get bit on it whenever I tie it on. Alrighty, next up we're going to talk about these two together because they are the exact same bait. These are both the Beebs Big Baits Blaster. We just got 2 different color patterns here. This guy is the green gill, and then this is like a B&A Customs paint job of like just a natural bluegill color. But yeah, I absolutely love these things. As you can tell, I have 2 of them. I bought this one. I actually won this one in a competition. He did a big fish competition. Whoever got the biggest fish over the course of like 2 weeks ended up winning like a custom little bait. So yeah, that's why I have 2 of them. I probably wouldn't have picked up the second one had I had an opportunity to buy another one. I think the green gill kind of is one of those do-it-all colors. I've been bit on this thing in super clear water. I've been bit on it in chocolate milk water. Everywhere in between, this thing just gets bit. Very similar to that G2, it's also like a wake and crank style bait, so you can keep this thing up along the surface of the water, or you can crank it down. I think it gets down to like 2 or 3 foot on a good long cast. But yeah, love these things. Catch a lot of fish on them. I think I caught like 20 or 25 fish on them last year. Caught a bunch of nice fish on them. I think the biggest fish that I caught was that one that won the tournament for me, which was like 4 1/4 pounds or something like that, 4.5 pounds. But yeah, overall, again, like I said, probably my confidence bait. Absolutely love these things. You will almost always find me throwing one around. All right, and then the last bluegill wake bait style bait that I have is this guy right here. This is a Hiroshima Customs. This is the Billrilla, I believe is what they call that. I don't know what color pattern this is, but again, just like a supernatural bluegill imitator. It's a very similar profile to the Beebs. I honestly just picked it up because I've always kind of wanted one of these things. Back in the day when I didn't know anything about swim bait fishing, I actually saw someone post a picture with one of these things. Thought it was super sick and figured if I ever had a chance, I'd pull the trigger on it. And I think I saw this one selling for like 65 or 70 bucks. So for that price, I couldn't let it go by. I ended up just picking it up last summer, and I think I caught like 8 or 9 fish on it so far. Again, I just found myself throwing the Beebs a whole lot more often than I found myself throwing this. They are very similar. They, again, wake and crank very similarly, so this one gets down to about 2 or 3 foot as well. But yeah, definitely a sweet little bait. Definitely have to play around with it a little bit more. It's been bit, as you guys can tell. This is a secondhand bait. I bought this, as you guys could probably imagine, used off of like one of those forums. So it's definitely been beat up. It's definitely caught some fish, both for whoever owned it before me as well as me. But yeah, pretty sweet little bait. Again, just kind of another bluegill style imitator. Didn't really need to add this one to the arsenal. This was just kind of those ones that I felt like I wanted to, so I did. All right, and these last 2 baits over here are actually both like true wake baits. They stay up on top of the water 100% of the time. No matter how fast you burn these things, they will not come off the surface of the water. They're also both made by the same company or the same guy. My buddy Dan from TopBananaLures actually made both of these for me, so we're going to kind of talk about them together because they are kind of very similar baits, even though they are technically different. But yeah, this little guy right here is the Sugarfoot Mouse. This is his 2-piece mouse style wake bait. Again, really like this thing. It's just kind of like a natural, almost wood grain color. I don't think he put anything more than just like a little bit of shellac or stain on that or whatever, but looks super natural, looks fantastic. I've caught probably 10 or 11 fish on this thing last summer. It's a great little bait, again, for ponds. I don't really find myself throwing that smaller profile in some bigger waters. That's generally where I'll probably pick up the bigger one, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, this little thing's the deal for smaller ponds and stuff. It's a great little night fishing bait. It's pretty loud, especially for its size. It's made out of wood, so it's got like a nice little clack to it. You can also walk this thing super well. It almost walks like a spook and stays in place side to side, so definitely a really sweet little bait right there. If you guys want to go check out my buddy Dan, I'll leave his information linked down below. He's got a YouTube channel and then like a Instagram page for himself, as well as one for his bait company, TopBananaLures. So I'll leave all of his information down below, as well as Beebs Big Baits. I'll leave all of his information down below as well, just in case you guys were interested in checking them out, showing them a little bit of support, picking up one of their baits or something. I'll leave those guys linked down below for you guys. But yeah, sweet little bait. I think it's probably only about 1.5 ounces, so really manageable bait. I don't think I've been mentioning the weight on any of the other baits that I've been talking about. I'm just now realizing the Beebs, I think, is like 3 ounces or so, 3¼ ounces, and then the Hero is probably right around there. And then the Black Dog Bait Company is like 1.5 ounces, 1/4, something like that. That's a super small bait, really manageable. You could throw that thing on like a light jig rod or something. But yeah, this guy's a little bit heftier. I think he's like right at like 1 3/4 ounces or something like that. But great little bait nonetheless. Really small, compact profile, again, for throwing around ponds and stuff. And then we got this big old guy right here. This is the Regolith Rat. So this is his 3-piece version. Again, that little one was a 2-piece. This one's a little bit bigger. That's that 3-piece. Just got that super natural like mouse rat fur pattern on it. It looks really sweet. I only picked this thing up towards the end of the year last year, so I never really ended up getting to throw it around all too much. I did get bit on it once or twice, but never ended up hooking up on it. But really sweet little bait. I just, again, got it right at the end of the top water season, so really didn't have a good amount of time to throw it around at all. But this spring and summer, we are definitely going to throw this thing around. I want to see what it's made out of for sure. I have noticed it doesn't walk as well as the 2-piece one, but you can still get this one to walk a little bit. But yeah, I don't really throw like a mouse-style topwater bait all too much, but we got a little rat, we got a big rat, so I think between those two, we got all the bases covered there. And that just about covers it for all the topwater baits, so now I think we're going to move on into the bluegill imitators. So, as you guys could probably imagine, where I live, most of the forage around here are bluegill. That's why you see me throw mostly bluegill imitating baits. A lot of my wake baits are bluegill style baits. A lot of my glide baits and 3-piece baits are bluegill style baits. And that's just because that's what naturally occurs around here. We just have a ton of bluegill. We don't have a ton of perch. We don't have a ton of crappie. We don't have a ton of shad. There are some places here and there that have like smaller populations of that stuff. But by and large, the main forage for these fish, at least as far as bait fish go, is going to be like a bluegill or a panfish species. And so as you can imagine, most of my swim baits are going to be imitating a bluegill of some sort. So we're going to start with a little one and kind of work our way up through the 3 pieces and then go through the glides as well. And I guess we'll start off with this little guy right here. This is a Mike Bucca baby bullgill. I feel like most people have seen this thing before. It's a sweet little bait though, for sure. I've thrown it around in some ponds and stuff. Again, it's not really one of those baits that I throw around in bigger waters because it is imitating that smaller profile bluegill. But for little pond bass and stuff like that, this thing absolutely kills it. I actually filmed a video with this thing when I first got it back like a year or 2 ago, so if you guys want to see that video, I'll leave a link down below for y'all. But it's a sweet little bait, again, for ponds and stuff. I feel like at some point I'll probably pick up the full-size bluegill, and that'll probably be more of like an average lake bait for me, just throwing around in like bigger bodies of water. But overall, I find that I generally tend to get bit and get a lot more attention in smaller bodies of water on this thing. And it doesn't really seem like you catch a lot of big fish on it. I'm sure you can. I'm sure if you put it in front of the right big fish, it'll eat it for sure, but I just haven't had a lot of good luck with catching big fish on this thing. I've noticed that it seems like those fish in that 1 to 1.5 pound range are the ones that really commit to this bait. But again, regardless, it's going to be a sweet little bait. If you want to get started on swim bait fishing, just get bit a few times. Or again, if you're just going out there trying to get bit. This is going to be one of those baits that I tie on if I'm fishing a small pond and just want to get bit. Very similar to the shell cracker. Alrighty, next up we got this guy right here. This is a 6 cents bait. It's called the Trace. This is actually one of the first original traces that came out on the market. I was lucky enough to get in on the first drop of this bait, as well as another 6 cents bait that we will talk about in just a minute. But got the first drop of this little guy, sweet little bait. I believe that's the bluegill spawn color is what they call that. And yeah, it's a sweet little color, sweet little bait. Again, it's a multi-jointed segmented bait. I believe they come in at like just over 1.5 ounces. So again, super manageable bait, but it's got like a supernatural S-waving swim to it. So really great little bait. I didn't really throw it around all too much ever since I got it. I just really threw it around for that one video that I filmed with it for the first impressions, and then never really picked it up again. But I did catch a few fish on it. I just don't really find myself throwing those multi-jointed swim baits all too much. But out of all my multi-jointed swim baits, this is probably going to be my favorite. I think I have like 3 or 4 of them, so that's really not saying all too much, but definitely out of the bluegill ones, this is my favorite by far. Again, I just don't really throw it all too much. It's just not a bait that I find myself picking up. I generally find myself throwing a glide a lot more than I do a multi-jointed swim bait, but definitely has its time and place and definitely gets bit. All right, and this last little bluegill multi-joint is actually going to be a knockoff bait. This is not a real bait. This is actually one of the knockoff versions of the Jackal Gantarelle. And on first look, it looks very similar to a Gantarelle. It doesn't have that third little hook thing out here, but other than that, it looks very, very similar. The only thing is that this is actually a slow sinking bait instead of like a floating bait like the normal Gantarelle is. That being said though, it does have a pretty solid like natural S-waving swim to it, so I do find myself throwing that thing a little bit. And since this one is a knockoff bait, I don't really care about it all too much, so I don't really mind throwing it around super shallow water, super grassy stuff, super sticky stuff, anything that you would really be worried throwing a big swim bait around. I don't really mind throwing this one around as much. And it gets bit. I've caught a few fish on it. Again, super natural looking bluegill profile on that, super natural paint job as well. But yeah, just kind of like a interesting little knockoff bait that I don't really find myself throwing too much. But again, has its time and place. Again, I just don't really throw multi-jointed swim baits all too much. But let me know if you guys want to see some of these multi-jointed baits a little bit more in the future. I'll probably end up throwing them around a little bit more as the summer rolls around. Alrighty, next up we got this guy. This is another bait that I don't really throw all too much, but I do really like this bait. This is actually the Arashi Glide. This is, I believe that's what they call it. It's just the Arashi Glide bait. It's about a 3.5 ounce bait, so a little bit bigger. It's probably about that like depths 175-ish size. And for the price, I don't think you can get a better bait than this. This is that bluegill color, so again, just kind of a new, super natural color. Again, I don't really throw this bait all too much just because it is kind of a longer profile, and I noticed that the bluegill, especially around here, tend to be a little bit taller. That being said though, I have been bit on it a few times. The color definitely works, the profile definitely works. It's just that I have a few baits that imitate a bluegill a little bit more naturally that I find myself gravitating towards a little bit more often. But yeah, again, really sweet little bait. I just don't really throw it around all too much just because, again, I have a few more bluegill imitators that I find imitate a bluegill a little bit more naturally. Speaking of those baits, actually, we'll start getting into those supernatural bluegill glides. This is actually another TopBananaLures bait that my buddy Dan made me. This is his gill glide, as you can imagine. Again, just like a 2-piece glide. This thing is huge. I think it weighs almost 6 ounces or something like that. It's a super slow sink. All of his baits are made out of wood, so they're all going to be pretty slow sink if you can get them to sink at all. But yeah, again, really sweet bait. I've thrown it around a little bit. I've been bit on it a few times, been hooked up on it a few times. I've only successfully landed 1 fish on it, but again, just one of those baits that I haven't really thrown around all too much. It's just really big. It's just a really big piece of wood, kind of unmanageable. I got to throw this on my heaviest swim bait setup. Again, I could probably get away with it on like my 300 size swim bait setup, but we'll get into those a little bit more, like I said. But yeah, it's just a really big bait, and I don't know what it is. I feel like the fish are just kind of intimidated by it. I've had a bunch of fish follow it in. I've had a bunch of fish, like I said, swipe at it, but it seems like they have a tendency to kind of nip at the side of it or kind of hit it on the top or hit it in the tail and don't tend to get the hooks all too well. But again, sweet little bait, just one of those ones that I don't really throw around all too much just because, again, I have a few more little bluegill baits that I tend to like a little bit better just because they tend to be a little bit more realistic and tend to work really, really well. But I guess we can kind of get into the 3 bluegill glide baits that I do find myself throwing a whole lot. We'll start off with this guy here. This is a Bait Sanity. This is the Antidote gill, I believe they call it. It's either the Antidote or the Explorer. I don't exactly remember. But this is a newer bait on the market. I think it only came out within the last year or so. But again, really sweet little bait. The folks over at Bass Baits Monthly were actually nice enough to send this little thing over to me. This is the floating version. They also come with a slow sink. These baits are really cool. They come with like a bunch of different tail options that you can buy. I just usually fish it with the normal tail in it with just a little chartreuse tips, but really great little bait. And again, this is the floating version, so I do find myself fishing this over the tops of grass beds a whole lot, especially in the spring and the fall when that grass is really starting to either get up or really starting to die off. This thing fished over the top of it is fantastic. But yeah, again, super fun bait to throw, super manageable bait. I really like this thing. Got to throw it around a little bit more in the spring as well. I feel like I got to throw most of these baits a little bit more. Most of the time last year, I feel like I was just tying the Beebs on and catching fish on that. So we definitely have to get a lot of these baits out in the water a little bit more and throw them around and see what they can do. And this is definitely one of those baits that I want to see what it can do for sure, especially this coming spring. Then we got this guy right here. I feel like everybody knows what this bait is. This is a depth bull shooter. It's the 160 size, so that's the full size bull shooter. I think this is the male gill color or something, but just a supernatural bluegill imitator. Again, I don't really find myself throwing this bait as much as you will find me throwing either that bait Sandy or the next bluegill glide that we're going to talk about, which happens to be my favorite. And I guess it really just comes down to the fact that this thing sinks a little bit too fast for my liking. I feel like a lot of the depths products do that where they sink a little bit faster. I hear that a lot about the 250 as well, but at least the 250 you can kind of tune it and kind of make it so it doesn't sink as fast. This one here though is kind of hard to tune. I don't really think there's any way that you can really make this thing sink any slower than it currently does out of the box, so I find myself throwing this thing around if I can find some deeper water. But if I'm fishing shallow, I'll usually either pick up the bait Sandy, like I said, because it's a floating bait, or the next bait that we'll talk about because it sinks super slow. This is again one of those like little bit more niche baits, I guess. I've only caught a few fish on it, like 3 or 4 fish on it. But yeah, anytime I can find like a deeper grass line or something like that, I will definitely throw the bull shooter around. It gets bit, it's got a supernatural swim to it, a supernatural gliding action. It's just, again, one of those baits that sinks a little bit fast for my liking, just fishing normally shallow water. I don't really like a bait that sinks super fast. I like to be able to kind of let it sit in front of a fish's face, and I feel like I'm not really able to do that with this thing as much. Now, this last bluegill glide bait is, like I said, my favorite by far. And this is the 86 Baits Tempest Gill. So this is a really hard bait to get your hands on. Most of the 86 baits are pretty hard to get your hands on. They're garage made baits, so they're kind of hard to get your hands on. Like I said, they're very limited when they come out on drops, and the drops tend to sell out really fast. But I was lucky enough to pick this one up secondhand from someone. And yeah, this thing is about as natural of a bluegill presentation as you can get. Again, super manageable. It's a little bit heavier. I think it's like 2 3/4 of an ounce, but really manageable as far as big baits go. It's got one of the most natural glides I've ever seen out of a bluegill swim bait. It just looks absolutely fantastic in the water. And the best part about it is it sinks super slow. So you can get this thing, put it out in the water, and if it's really cold water, it will almost just sit there and suspend. In warmer water, like over 60-degree water temperature, it will sink a little bit faster, but still a pretty slow sinking bait. But if you're fishing water under that 60-degree mark, this thing is a killer. I cannot wait to get this thing out early spring and see what it can do. Again, this is one of those baits that I didn't really throw around all too much. Just because I was a little bit scared to lose it, to be honest, but the more I threw it around, the more I loved it, and I'm definitely going to have to get this thing out some more in the spring, because like I said, this is far and away my favorite bluegill glide bait that I currently have, and this thing's going to get absolutely roughed up. I've seen a lot of people catch a lot of big fish on this thing, and I'm sure it's going to catch a big one for me too. Alrighty, while we're on the bluegill subject, I guess we can talk about these 2 little soft baits real quick, just because I don't really have any soft baits whatsoever. These are the only 2 soft baits that I currently have at the moment in the arsenal. But these are both the exact same bait. These are 2 unique gills. Just got 2 different colors here. Got the crappie one there, and then I believe they call that one like Copperfield or something like that, or Copperhead, Copper Nose, something like that. But just 2 different like natural bluegill / crappie imitators. These little things are sweet. They're actually designed to be drug on the bottom like a jig, but you can slow swim them as well. I've been bit with them both ways. And yeah, they're really sweet little baits. Like I said, I don't really throw a soft plastic swim bait all too much, but it's one of those things that I really want to work on, especially this spring and summer. So we're definitely gonna have to throw these things around a little bit more in the summer and see what we can do with them, but they look really sweet in the water. Again, I've been bit on both of them, both colors. They're both really sweet little baits. Again, just not something that I find myself reaching for all too much. But again, like I said, I do want to get better at throwing soft plastic swim baits. It's just not something that I find myself throwing all too much. I find that I just have better luck and get better bites and stuff on the glide baits and stuff like that. So that's generally why you'll see me throwing those a little bit more often. But again, I will recognize that there is a time and place where a soft plastic swim bait really comes into play. So definitely going to have to figure these things out a little bit more and get a little bit more practice with them. All right, so I got a couple of glide baits that are actually designed to kind of look like like a bass. We're going to talk about this little guy real quick. This is a Thunderhawk Lures Cha-Cha Glide. This is a little like $16 bait, but this thing's awesome. Again, it's one of those baits that I find myself throwing around in ponds and stuff a lot. If I'm looking for like a little micro glide bait style presentation, this is the bait that I'm reaching for. I hear a lot of people talk a lot of good things about the River to Sea S-Waver, and I don't know why more people aren't talking about this thing. In my opinion, this thing is better than the S-Waver in every possible way. It glides better, it looks better, they have better colors, better hardware, just everything about it is better. They cost less money. And yeah, I would highly suggest picking some of these up. Like I said, this is that bass pattern. It does look a little bit stupid, but they do have some better color patterns on there. But I have caught some decent fish on this bass color, so definitely wouldn't discount the like weird looking colors that they have on the website. This one definitely works. Again, just not one of those baits that I throw around all too much anymore, just because I find myself throwing around some bigger baits a little bit more often. But yeah, really fun bait to throw around. Just again, one that I don't really throw around all too much anymore, just because I find myself throwing some bigger baits a lot of the time. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we got this big old boy here. This is a Clash 9. Everybody knows the DRT Clash series, so this is just the baby bass or the largemouth bass color Clash 9. Where that one is inexpensive, this bait is very expensive. I believe this one cost me like 120 bucks, but you can find them all the way up to like almost 200 bucks these days. They are ridiculously priced on some of the forums and stuff. But I was able to get this one in a really sweet color. Caught a few fish on this one. I caught a bunch of really tiny fish on it for whatever reason. It seems like I'm really good at catching like 12 to 15 inch fish on like 9 to 10 inch baits. And they especially seem to love this Clash. I think the biggest fish I've caught on this thing is like maybe 2 pounds or something like that. So for whatever reason, seem to catch a lot of little tiny fish on this thing. The Clash 9s are really cool. If you guys don't know, you can take the lips out, you can take the tails out, switch them out for different tails. Each tail, each lip gives the bait different action, makes it dive to a different depth or something like that. And yeah, it's a really technique specific bait. I don't really find myself throwing the Clash as much as I feel like a lot of other people do. I feel like it's one of those hype baits that a lot of people get like really stoked about. And it definitely has its place for sure. I find that it works really well if you're trying to fish it around cover or something like that. But for an open water glide, I find that there are a lot better options out there. And a lot of the time when I'm fishing a glide bait, I am fishing over open water. So I don't usually find myself fishing this one as much as a lot of other people do, like I said. But yeah, definitely going to be seeing this thing on the channel a lot more in the future. All right, and last up out of the baits that we're going to talk about are going to be these guys. These are going to be like my shad bait fish style imitators. Like I said, we don't really have a ton of shad around here, so I don't have a ton of shad imitators, but do have a couple. This one right here is actually a striper bait that I used to use back east for fishing for striped bass. Back when I lived on Long Island, that was one of my favorite baits to target striped bass with. Didn't really catch all too much on it, although I did catch a couple of smaller ones on it every once in a while, but just a sweet little bait to throw for sure. That's a Sabile. I believe they call that the Magic Swimmer. It's just like a 3-piece multi-jointed swim bait. Again, sinks kind of fast. Like I said, it is a saltwater bait originally, so they do design it to kind of be fished in salt water. So they do tend to sink a little bit fast, but again, I haven't bet on this thing for some stripers. Figured I'd just throw it in this swim bait box just because I feel like a bass probably would hit that one too if given the opportunity. Let me know if you guys want to see like a saltwater swim bait in freshwater challenge or something like that. Be more than happy to tie this thing on, see if we can't get bit on it. All right, next up I got this little thing. This is probably one of the coolest baits that I own. This is a Roman made trick. It's the 3-piece lipped version. So they have a lipped version as well as a lipless version. The lipless version is a slow sink. The lipped version is a slow float. But yeah, like I said, this is the lip version. I picked this thing up originally thinking it was going to be a wake bait. I had seen some videos of some guys fishing it like subsurface, like a wake bait or something. And to be fair, you can fish this thing subsurface. But I noticed it was almost more like a subtle crankbait. It gets down to like 3, almost 4 feet on a long cast. So definitely not a wake bait unless you work it really slow and keep your rod tip up super high. But yeah, a really sweet bait, just kind of a niche bait. Again, we don't really have a lot of places with shad in it, and a lot of the places that we have with shad in it don't tend to get deep enough to where I can actually throw this thing. So it's one of those baits I wish I could throw more than I do. I just don't really have a lot of places around that I can throw it at, but got a couple of places in mind that I want to maybe try it at this spring. And yeah, super cool to have this bait in the arsenal. Like I said, it's kind of a niche bait, so I don't really throw it all too much, but we'll definitely have to get this thing out in the water some more in the spring and see what it can do. Like I said, it does just get down a little bit deep, so it is a little bit sketchy to fish this thing over some shallow water, but we'll definitely find some deeper holes and try and throw this thing around, see if we can't find something that wants to commit to it. Alrighty, the second to last bait we're going to be talking about is this guy here. This is a 6 cents draw, so like I said, I got in on the first drop of the draw as well as the trace, so this is one of the original ones. To be honest, when I bought this bait, I kind of bought it for 2 reasons, and neither of them were really because I wanted to fish the bait. First of all, I figured it would be kind of an interesting video. I feel like a lot of people would click on it, would get a bunch of views, all that stuff. But the second reason was, if you guys didn't know, when they first dropped these baits, Ben Milliken actually went to the 6th Sense warehouse and signed all the boxes of the first original drop of the draws. So I actually wanted to buy this thing more because I wanted to get my hands on one of Milliken's signatures. But yeah, like I said, this was one of the first runs of the draw, so that's pretty cool. Again, I've had this bait for about as long as it's been on the market, as you could probably imagine. Caught about 8 or 9 fish on it. Definitely seemed to catch a lot of like 2 to 3 pound fish on it for whatever reason. It's not the easiest bait to fish. It took me some time to actually get it dialed in and figure out how to properly work this thing, but once you get it kind of figured out and really figure out your cadence and your rod movements and everything, it's not a terrible bait to fish, and it definitely gets bit. And yeah, I actually had a really great day where I took this thing out and actually outfished my buddy Jack while he was throwing a Hinkle shad, so that was pretty sweet. I think that was more because I was just able to get my bait further away from the bank than anything else, but overall felt great to outfish that dude with like a bait that was 1/10 of the price of his. But yeah, got a couple of places again, like I said, that I want to throw around some of these Shad style glide baits and stuff, so we'll definitely have to get this thing out in the spring and see if we can knock even more paint off of it. Alright, and this last bait that we're going to talk about is this guy right here. This is actually a Zimmer Bait Co. It's the 8-inch Instigator, so this is their bigger version of their Shad style bait. This is the golden shiner pattern, as you guys can probably tell. Super natural looking color. Again, just wanted something a little bit different. I don't have any golden shiner style swim baits in here. And we do again have a couple of ponds where they have golden shiners around here for whatever reason. A little bit of a funny story about this bait actually. So Zimmer Bait Company actually used to be Golden Swim Baits. They've recently changed hands and switched operations to another Zimmer Bait Company, but when the new owner, I guess, bought the company, he was looking for a new painter to work with him, and I guess he sent a few different baits out to a few different painters just to see what they could do. This was actually one of those baits, so this is actually a 1-of-1 paint color. There's only one of these golden shiner instigators in the world, and this is it. As you guys can tell though, this thing is getting real beat up. This is only after 2 fish, so I think whoever painted this bait originally didn't do a great job of sealing it, or didn't do a great job of like painting it or making sure the paint stayed on it properly, and as you can tell, this thing is losing paint real quick. But I reached out to the guys over at Zimmer Bait Company, and they were nice enough to actually send me a replacement. So when I do that unboxing of all my new swim baits and stuff, that'll be one of the baits in that box. But honestly, I wasn't too worried about it. I'll probably fish this thing until it has no more paint on it. Again, the bait swims super great. It's a really slow sinking bait, which again, I really like fishing over shallower water. And I gotta be honest, it's got a great action. I think the bait only ends up being like 125 or 120 bucks or something like that, but it's got an action very similar to a lot of those $200, $300, $500. Again, like I said, we got that replacement coming in, so we'll have 2 of these at some point, so I'm really excited to see what these things can do come the springtime when those fish start feeding up on some bigger bait and stuff. Alrighty folks, so real quick, we're just gonna go over my rods and reels that I used to throw my big swim baits. So I got 3 rods and reels at the moment for throwing big swim baits. Like I said, some of these baits are pretty manageable. You could throw a few of them on like a heavy jig rod or something like that, but 9 times out of 10, if I'm throwing a big swim bait, I'm gonna be throwing it on one of these 3 rods. So this is my first rod that we're gonna talk about. This is a 7'5" actually. It's a Phoenix M1. It's one of the older versions of the M1. It's got the full grip, which I really like. And then on here, I have a Daiwa Coastal. This is the 200 size Coastal. This is the older version. They recently redesigned the Coastal, so it looks a little bit different. And I think they come in some different sizes now as well. But I've wanted one of these reels forever. I ended up picking one up towards the end of the year last year. For whatever reason, this reel didn't sound great out of the box. I think it needed some oil, so I threw some oil in it over the winter. Hopefully that'll make the sound go away. But overall, I really like this setup. Again, I really like the rod. It's a little bit of a weird rod. Like I said, it's a 7'5". When I first bought it, I figured this was actually going to be like a frogging or a flipping rod or something like that. I bought this rod like sight unseen from one of my friends, and he just told me he had a 7'5" that he was trying to sell. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll just get like a frogging and flipping rod. But this actually ended up being a 1 to 6 ounce swim bait rod. I don't know if I mentioned, but I have this rod spooled up with 20-pound fluorocarbon. I probably could go down to 17 or something like that, but generally on these bigger swim baits, I like to stick with 20 or 25 or something like that. But yeah, it's a sweet little rod. I probably wouldn't throw baits all the way up to that 6 ounce range on it, but anything all the way up to like 3.5 ounces I've thrown on this thing, and it handles it pretty well. I've thrown everything up to about the Clash 9 on it, and this thing seems to handle that bait perfectly well. But yeah, this is kind of like my smaller swim bait rod. So I'll throw stuff like the Bait Sendigo or the 86. I'll throw like the Arashi Glide or like any of those smaller multi-jointed swim baits. The 2-piece rat is also a great bait to throw on this rod. Again, just any of my smaller swim baits is generally what you'll find me throwing on this rod. Alrighty, my second swim bait setup is going to be this big old guy right here. So this is an 8-foot. It's a Daiwa DX SB, so it's the 2 to 8 ounce. It's a heavy, I believe, is what they consider this, but rated for baits from that 2 to 8 ounce range. I probably wouldn't throw baits that are up to that 8 ounce range on this thing. I'd probably keep it around like 5.5 or 6 or something like that, but it's a pretty sweet rod. This is kind of my do-it-all-purpose rod. And on here, I have a 300 size Shimano Scorpion MD. This is one of the newer Scorpions, so I think they just recently came out with this one last spring or last winter or something like that. So not a super old reel, definitely hasn't been on the market for too long. I got this one for my birthday this past summer and I've been loving it ever since I had it. Again, like I said, this is kind of my do-it-all rod. I can do pretty much anything on this thing. I can throw baits all the way down to that 2 ounce range on it, and I can throw stuff, like I said, all the way up to probably about 6 ounces on this rod. Again, I probably won't go all the way up to like the full 8, and I probably wouldn't go all the way down to like a 2 ounce bait, but you could get away with it if you wanted. But generally any of those baits in that 3 to 5.5, 6 ounce range I will throw on this rod. And it handles baits that size perfectly, from the Clash to the Bull Shooter to the Instigator to that 3-piece rat. It'll throw pretty much everything. I'm sure you could throw something as big as like a Depths 250 or that big like Top Banana Glide Gill on this thing if you really wanted to. But generally, if for a bait that size, I'll probably step it up to my next swim bait rod. I think I caught like 30 or 40 fish on this rod this past year, so definitely put it through its paces and it's been holding up pretty well. Again, I think that's like $100 rod, so not super expensive rod, not the best rod. It's definitely pretty heavy for throwing big swim baits and stuff. And of course, if you buy a rod for $100, you're not going to get like the best rod on the market. So there definitely are better swim bait rods on the market than this one, but for what I use it for and what I need it for, it definitely gets the job done. And I'll usually run this one with either 20 or 22 pound fluorocarbon on it. Right now it's got 20 pound on it. Again, I'll kind of step it up to that 22 if I really feel like I need to, but again, most of the time if I'm throwing a big swim bait, I'll find myself throwing 20 pound fluorocarbon. Alrighty, and this last setup is going to look very similar to that last one. This is actually the same rod, just a little bit heavier. This is again that Daiwa DX SB swim bait rod, but this is the extra heavy version, so rated for baits from 3 to 10 ounces. This thing is a broomstick. This is for all of those super heavy baits. Anything over 5 ounces I'm comfortable throwing on this rod, so again, right now that's pretty much just the TopBananaLures Glide, but again, I got a couple other baits coming that I might be able to throw on this rod as well. But yeah, like I said, it is an absolute broomstick. This is my big swim bait setup. I don't really use it all too much. Again, I honestly wish I could throw it around a little bit more than I do. Just seems like I need to get some bigger, heavier baits is what it sounds like. But just at the moment, I don't find myself using this thing all too much. Again, we'll probably just have to pick up a few more bigger baits to specifically throw on this rod. But it's a sweet little rod when I do get to throw it around. And like I said, it's got that 400 Tranks on there. If you guys have never used the Tranks before, it's a fantastic reel. I love the Trankses. I would probably have 8 of them if I could afford it. But for right now, we just have the one. And yeah, this is my big swim bait setup, as I keep saying. I don't really throw this thing around. Like I said, you guys probably don't see it on the channel all too much, but every once in a while, if I'm picking up like a real big bait or like a super big presentation or something, then I'll throw it on this rod. And as you can imagine, this thing's beefed up in every single way, and the line is no exception. On here, I actually have 30 pound Trilene Big Game, so that's 30 pound monofilament. Again, I usually throw fluorocarbon on my swim baits and most things for that matter, but for this specific application, I like that 30 pound. When you're throwing something as heavy as like 5 or 6 ounces, you don't want that thing to just like snap on the line, because no matter how strong of a line you have enough of those snappages happen, you're going to eventually break the bait off. And so I use monofilament because it stretches a little bit more than fluorocarbon, and hopefully that'll soften that impact a little bit so I'm not breaking off baits as often. But yeah, folks, I think that's going to do it for today's video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any of these baits that you want to see me specifically make a video about in the future, I'm more than happy to do that. Just let me know down in the comments section. If you guys like the video, hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see some more content from me, especially if you guys want to see some more swim bait content, because we got a whole bunch of swim baits and I'm going to try and catch a whole bunch of fish on them. But I think it's going to do it for me. I'll check and wreck them, and I'll catch you on the next one. I'm out. Peace.